January 17th, 1945, Iwo Jima, Western Pacific. The sky above the volcanic island split open with thunder. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto stood on the observation deck of the Naval Command Post, his binoculars trained on the silver glint disappearing into the eastern horizon. Another B-29 superfortress, trailing black smoke from its No. 3 engine, limping back towards Saipan. He had watched his anti-aircraft batteries tear into its fuselage, seen the flak rip through aluminum skin like paper. By all logic, by every principle of engineering he had learned at the Imperial Naval Academy, that aircraft should have fallen from the sky. Instead, it flew on, wounded but defiantly swallowed by distance and cloud. Yamamoto lowered his binoculars. In his hand, he clutched a maintenance log from a captured P-51 Mustang found 3 weeks earlier in the wreckage near Chichijima. The routine inspection intervals astounded him. Oil changes every 50 hours. Complete engine overhauls at 400. The Americans discarded parts his own mechanics would have carefully restored, polished, and reinstalled. He thought of the key 84 fighters on his own airfield, cannibalized daily to keep even half their number operational. This log represented something beyond mere wealth. It represented a philosophy he was only beginning to comprehend. The B-29 raids had begun in earnest 6 months earlier, in June of 1944, when the first superfortresses lifted off from bases in China to strike the Japanese home islands. The Japanese High Command had anticipated these attacks. They had studied intelligence reports, examined crashed American bombers, prepared their defenses. What they had not anticipated was the rhythm, the relentless mechanical rhythm. A B-29 damaged over Osaka would return to Saipan or Tinian, and Japanese observers would mark it in their logs as destroyed or critically damaged. 3 days later, the same aircraft, identified by its nose art, by the distinctive pattern of patched bullet holes, would appear again over Tokyo, then again, and again.
Japanese fighter pilots reported the phenomenon with growing unease. Captain Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces, wrote in his combat diary of engaging a superfortress over Nagaya that he had positively identified from a previous encounter 2 weeks earlier. His cannons had shredded its tail section in that first battle. Now the tail gleamed with fresh aluminum patches, and the aircraft flew as if it had never tasted fire. "They do not repair their bombers," Sakai wrote. "They resurrect them." The mathematics confounded Japanese strategic planning. Imperial military doctrine held that a 10% maintenance capability was acceptable for sustained operations. The Americans operated at 70%. When a B-29 returned to Saipan with battle damage, ground crews swarmed it within minutes. Massive cargo aircraft delivered entire replacement engines still in their shipping crates. Prefabricated fuselage sections arrived by transport ship, machined to such precise tolerances that they bolted into place without modification. The Japanese had built their war machine on craftsmanship, on the careful hands of skilled technicians coaxing life from limited resources. The Americans had built theirs on abundance, on the assumption that materials were infinite and time was the only currency that mattered. At the Nakajima aircraft plants outside Tokyo, engineers worked 18-hour shifts attempting to match American production. They failed not from lack of skill, but from lack of everything else: aluminum, rubber, ball bearings, high-octane fuel. The raw materials that flowed endlessly into American factories had been choked off by submarine blockades and bombing campaigns. A Zero fighter required 2,000 man-hours to construct. A P-51 Mustang required less than 800, and the Americans were producing them at 15 times the rate. But it was not the quantity alone that broke Japanese morale. It was the waste. Intelligence officers reported that Americans discarded damaged aircraft components that Japanese mechanics would have considered perfectly serviceable. Engines with 1,000 hours remaining in their service life, scrapped because newer models had arrived. The psychological impact was devastating. By February 1945, the doctrine had crumbled entirely. General Curtis LeMay's bombers flew in daylight now, at low altitude, stripped of most defensive armament to carry more incendiaries. They flew as if Japanese defenses were inconvenient rather than deadly, and in a sense, they were right. A B-29 shot down over Tokyo represented perhaps 3 days of American production. The 30 trained crewmen aboard represented a greater loss, but even they were replaceable in ways the Japanese could no longer match. Flight schools in Texas and Arizona churned out pilots with 200 hours of training. Japanese pilots now launched with 40, their instructors having been fed into the furnace of attrition. The symbolic weight of this imbalance crystallized around a single image, the silver skin of the B-29 itself. Japanese aircraft were painted in camouflage, their metal surfaces treated to reduce visibility, their production hurried, and their finishes rough. The superfortresses flew unpainted, their aluminum skin polished to a mirror shine, reflecting sunlight like beacons visible for 50 miles. This was not arrogance. This was statement. We have so much aluminum that we need not conserve even the paint. We fly in daylight because we can afford to replace what you destroy. The shine itself became a weapon of psychological warfare, a daily reminder of industrial might that no amount of courage could overcome. Commander Yamamoto would survive the war. In 1947, during the Allied occupation, he toured a Boeing manufacturing facility in Seattle as part of a reconciliation delegation. He watched a B-29 roll off the production line every 63 minutes. He stood on the factory floor and wept, not from shame, but from understanding. The war had not been lost at Midway or Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima. It had been lost here, in the assembly lines and supply chains, in the fundamental American assumption that resources existed to be used rather than hoarded. That damaged things could be fixed quickly because the parts were already in the warehouse. That abundance itself could be a weapon sharper than any sword. The B-29s returned because they could. And in that simple fact lay the entire mathematics of victory.